So, Bhante, we call him Bhante. You might not know what that means when you first come along to the centre and you hear we talk about Bhante. His name is Sangharakshita, Urgyen Sangharakshita. And Bhante is an affectionate term. It means something like dear teacher. He's our dear teacher. So that's what that means, so you know now. And he was born in London in 1925, so 90 years ago. 90 years ago in 2 days' time, on the 26th. And when he says that he was largely self-educated. I won't tell you how that came about, because that will take too long, but he was largely self-educated. And when he was 16, he bought a book called the Diamond Sutra and the Sutra of Hui Nang, and two ancient Buddhist texts. And he read them, and he had a deep insight into the Dharma. And he says of that experience that he realized that he was a Buddhist and always had been. And I can believe that. A couple of years ago, I was on a long retreat and I read most of Bhante's memoirs from the time he moved to India until he came back to England. So I think about 20 years, something like that. And it was remarkable, actually. How did he get to India? It was the beginning of the Second World War, and he was conscripted into the army. And at the age of 19, he was posted to India. What amazing serendipity, isn't it? Posted to India. And he was really, really pleased about that, as he says, to be posted to the birthplace of the Buddha. And at the end of the war, technically he deserted. He should have come back to England, but he just walked off one day. And he and a friend of his, who was also interested in Buddhism, they went forth. They went and they lived the homeless life for 2 years, wandering around India, looking for teachers. All they found was Hindu teachers. In those days, Buddhism had died out from India, so their memoirs talk about meeting one Hindu teacher after another, and he learnt from them. Some of them he rated very highly indeed, some of them not so highly. And one of the interesting things about reading that section was that he never wavered in his desire to be a Buddhist. I think if it was for me, if I just kept meeting Hindu teachers all the time, I'd have probably gone, oh, to hell with it. I'll become a Hindu. Does it matter? But not Bhante. He was dead sure. And he said at the end of that, after meeting many, many Hindu teachers, he was even more confirmed in his desire to go for refuge to the Buddha. Which he did. So in 1949, I think it was. Doing very well here, close over the page. 1949, he was ordained as a novice monk. So he did meet some Buddhists eventually. Unfortunately, they weren't very nice to him. The monks who met him and ordained him were very, very reluctant to ordain him. And they had what seems like quite a deep distrust of this Western man wanting to become a Buddhist. So he had not a very good experience there. So he became a novice monk. A year later, he was ordained fully as a Buddhist monk. And he was so happy for that. Interesting thing about Bhante's life here is that he had very little experience of Sangha, of spiritual community, very little. Certainly the Buddhists he met didn't offer that. In fact, you could say they offered the opposite. But he was always convinced that Sangha was really, really important. Very interesting, when he came back to Britain after very little actual experience, his own personal experience of Sangha, he was convinced that Sangha, spiritual community, was one of the most important aspects of the Dharma life. So he was ordained. He looked for Buddhist teachers. He found one in a man called Jagdish Kashyap, who was a scholar of Pali and the Abhidharma. And he studied with Jagdish Kashyap for a year or two. And Jagdish Kashyap was employed by a university, and he by then was quite disillusioned by the academic life, and he was a monk actually, Jagdish Kashyap, but he wanted to really immerse himself fully in the Dharma. Can't help thinking that he was influenced by Sangharakshita here. But anyway, they went on a tour. He took a sabbatical and they went on a tour around India together, and they ended up in a place called Kalimpong, up in the hills. And there were some Buddhists there. And Jagdish Kashyap left Sangharakshita there and said, stay here and work for the good of Buddhism. So he did. Because at that time, Sangharakshita, he made it his practice to do whatever his teacher told him to do. So he told him to stay there, and he did. And he stayed there for the next 14 years. Really interesting part of his life, actually. Many, many years later, I was talking to him about that period and then the period in England. And he said, my period in India was much more interesting than my life in Britain has been. He met so many people, princes and princesses and all sorts of people. Kalimpong was quite a place. But anyway, he just tirelessly worked for the Dharma there. He set up a magazine, Stepping Stones. He wrote a survey of Buddhism at the age of 26, this big fat volume of Buddhism at the age of 26. Imagine that. Anybody 26 years old here? Less? Anybody less than 26 years old? Can you imagine writing a big fat volume of Buddhism? Amazing. He was and is an amazing man. How am I doing for time? I've got no idea. So that was Jagdish Kashyap. So Jagdish Kashyap left him, and there he was, trying to live as a Buddhist, and he had various adventures. Met many teachers. At that time, the Chinese had invaded Tibet, and many people were fleeing from Tibet, and quite a few of them were Buddhist teachers, Buddhist lamas, Tibetan lamas, and he met many of them. Here's another very interesting thing about Bhante. He was ordained into the Theravada, but was always inspired by the Bodhisattva ideal. And as soon as he found a teacher who taught the Bodhisattva ideal, he went straight there. And he was given many initiations by these teachers, made friends with them. It's really worth reading those memoirs, actually. It's a really good thing to do. He stayed there for 14 years, and he would have stayed there for the rest of his life. He was very happy. He had his own little, what he calls a monastery. I think a monastery, you need a few people living there, don't you? But he was kind of living on his own, more like a hermitage. And very happy, meditating, writing about Buddhism. And every year he would go down into the plains of India and go on what he called teaching tours. He said he taught in every state in India except for Kashmir. So part of his time as a recluse up in Kalimpong, quite a lot of his time out there teaching. In 1959, he got involved in the mass conversion movement of ex-untouchable Indians to Buddhism under Dr. Ambedkar. He met Dr. Ambedkar, and 56. Did I say 59? Okay. It's 59 in my notes. Okay, we'll say it's 56. So he was very occupied. Another thing that I find really remarkable about him is how one-pointed, single-minded he was, and still is. Just his whole life has just been devoted to practicing and teaching the Dharma. That's all he does, basically. It's all he wants to do. Fantastic. He stayed there for 14 years, and he would have lived there for the rest of his life, except he received an invitation from the English Sangha Trust to come and try and heal a rift that happened between two Buddhist groups, the English Sangha Trust and the Buddhist Society. So he came back to try and heal that rift, but inevitably what happened is they fell out with him. He went back to Kalimpong. He decided he was going to stay here. Buddhism needed the West needed Buddhism, he realised. So he went back to tidy up his affairs with the idea to come back and stay here. He got a letter when he was there from them saying, we don't want you back here. You must resign your position. So he loves to tell this story, actually, so I'll tell it. He was with a friend and he said, you know what this means, don't you? He said, no. He said, this means the start of a new Buddhist movement. He loves to tell that story. So he came back to Britain, and he did in fact start up the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, and the first ordinations were in 1967. Am I right there, Peng Shui? 1967. Yeah, and he ordained many, many hundreds of people after that, and then he asked some of his disciples to take up the ordinations. How long have I got?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Now I want to tell you about my experience of Bhante just for 2 minutes. Not so much my experience, but our experience. When we were a small Buddhist movement in Britain in the early 1970s, mid-1970s, it was very, very exciting. You have no idea how fabulous it was. Most of us, it was quite a young movement. Most of us were very young. We had long hair. We had just come out of the whole hippie era. And we were still very much influenced by that, of changing the world. We were idealists and we wanted to change the world. And Bhante was right into that. He really encouraged us. So he wasn't just teaching us, he was encouraging us to change the way we lived. So we began to live together in communities. In North London, where there was a Buddhist centre, the whole area where this Buddhist centre was being knocked down. The government were just knocking the whole place down. They're going to rebuild the whole thing. But there were these houses empty. Everyone had left them and the houses were empty. So what did? We moved into them. We squatted these houses and we started up communities, and we worked for the centre, and we started up right livelihood businesses and renovating that great big place in London, the London Buddhist Centre, this fire station. 2.5 years we were there renovating this fire station, setting up businesses so that we could finance the renovation of that fire station. It was remarkably exciting. And Bhante was right into this. He wasn't in there helping us renovate, but he knew that we were doing it. So what he would do, he would teach us the Dharma. We would then try and put that into practice in what we were doing. He would notice what we were doing, then he would teach again on the basis of what we just did. And then we would change that, and then he would teach again. So there was this dialogue going on between Bhante and his disciples. Us trying to put into practice what he taught, he seeing what we were doing and asking us to make adjustments and inspiring us. And he gave these two main ways he taught. One was lecture series. And I remember being at 2 of them. They were remarkable. The Sutra of Golden Light lecture series, Transformation of Self and World. This is what we thought we were doing. We felt we were transforming the world. That's what we were doing. We weren't just working on ourselves. We were trying to change the world. This is exactly what we thought we were doing. Bhante was really encouraging us. And so he gave this fantastic lecture series on this ancient Buddhist text called the Sutra of Golden Light. 8 lectures, all about not only transforming self, but transforming world, what that meant, how to go about it. Then we would try and do that. And he would notice us doing that. Then he would give seminars, seminar after seminar after seminar. 8, 10, 12 people go on this seminar. He would weave into his teaching things that he'd noticed about what we were doing and things that we probably shouldn't be doing and things we could do better, and he'd weave that in, and those people would go back to their various centres and they would disseminate what he taught. Then he would give another lecture series. The next great lecture series I went to was the one on the Vimalakirti Desha. What a lecture series. So it was utterly magical, utterly magical. The first of that lecture series was called Building the Buddha Land. We were building Sukhavati at the time, or the fire station. We were building. And he was so into that, and he gave this lecture on building the Buddha Land, which I'm sure most of you know, but can you imagine what that must have been like when we were out there? None of us had jobs. We were all trying to just do what we could and earn money in whatever way we could and just build the Buddha Land. Utterly brilliant. And then he would give more seminars, and it would go like that. We would do something, he would teach. We would do something, he would teach. It's this fabulous dialogue between us. And that went on for about, 15, 20 years, and then he began to withdraw from active involvement, maybe, how long was that? No, more like 30 years, wasn't it? Then he began to withdraw, and he wanted to hand over his responsibilities. So he began to hand over his responsibilities to senior order members. And that's been going on for, it must be 20 years now. Yeah, there's no ending to this talk. I could just go on and on, so I'm just going to have to stop now.